Hi, everybody. Um, what we're going to do with this lecture video is I'm going to be sharing some information about the preamble and about the three parts of government that are in the Constitution of the United States. If you're looking to see what document we're going to be using for our notes, we're going to be using the Gold Sheet 4 notes. And those notes look like this. They are posted in this week's content, I guess you could say, or material. So there's two sides to it. There's one that shows you the standard that we're going to be following, which is what are the responsibilities and powers that the government, citizens, and the free press have. That's described in the Constitution. There's some vocabulary words that you should be familiar with. And then I'm going to basically break down a little bit about the preamble with you to start the video. And then I'm going to be getting into some of the powers of the three branches of government and their responsibilities, talking a little bit about how a bill becomes a law, and also discussing with you some key terms like separation of powers and checks and balances and things like that. So this is going to be another fairly lengthy video. My recommendation to you is that you watch this in parts, just like I recommended in the last one. And so without any further ado, let's get started on this as I share the opening slides for you to take a look at. Okay. There are a couple of things that you should be able to answer when we are finished with this. There's two focus questions really that I think you should be able to answer. Number one, what are the basic principles that are set forth in this document that we call the Constitution? Again, the Constitution was written with the intent to fix the problems of the Articles of Confederation. So when the Constitutional Convention delegates met, they met with the idea to come up with a new form or a new plan for government. You should also be able to know what are the three branches of this new federal government and what powers do they have? Like what can they actually accomplish? Some things that you might want to think about is, why do we create plans for anything? Why do we create a plan? If we think about, and this is from my old school, if we think about what is our student handbook at Burrell, right? What is this plan, this student handbook, what does it do for the staff and students at Burrell? And how is it similar to a plan for government? If you look at it in detail, it really describes to you, it makes promises essentially to you about what the school is going to provide to you, but it also has in it what it expects from you as a student as well. And it also gives you lots of tools, right? You can think of the Constitution as being a plan that shows you or provides for you what sort of the operating plan here is at Burrell, but also it has tools in it to help you be a better student. And so if you think about our student handbook and some of the things that it provides, if you actually look through it, it actually provides quite a bit of information about what to expect while you're here and what's expected of you while you're here, and also what's expected from me, right, and the staff. And the Constitution is very similar in that. If you were to open up your book, you can find the Constitution there on pages 249 to 269. And you'll notice that it has parts to it. We call the introduction the preamble to the Constitution. It sort of outlines what the foundation of the Constitution is based upon, what it expected to accomplish. And then it has 7 articles, or you can think of articles as almost like chapters, okay, to this. And then it has at the very end some changes that were added, that were conditional, that had to be added for all the states to sign it or ratify the Constitution. And we call those first 10 changes or amendments, we call them the Bill of Rights. But there are 17 more changes that have been added over time to this document to equal 27 amendments or changes. So in, I believe it was assignment number 19, one of the things that was discussed was this idea about the elastic clause, right? And the elastic clause essentially tells you that the Constitution is meant to be changed. So one of the ways that it's one of the ways that it changes is through the amendment process, where we can add to this document because it tells us we can. That's what the founders intended. We can add to it and we can change it. Okay. So the amendment process is the adding of changes to the document, but also, taking things out if we thought that that was necessary as well. In this week's agenda, you have a video that's really fun to watch. It's called Schoolhouse Rocks: The Preamble, and I would recommend watching this. It's a really cool video. I'm not going to show it to you here. You can watch it. You can stop this video and watch it. I would recommend that you do that. But it's a classic. It's something that I watched when I was a little kid, actually, much younger than you, actually. I think I was probably in my pajamas sitting in front of a television set with an old dial changer on it on Saturday mornings and Sunday mornings, and it would play along with the cartoons, like with the Roadrunner and, Daffy Duck and all these other things that I would watch. But it was a way to teach us. It was a way to help us reinforce some of these early ideas about our Constitution, what it's about. So take a look at it, play it. It's some of you may have actually seen it. And if you haven't seen it, it's worth watching. It's a classic. It's an American classic. The preamble states this. This is the introduction, and this is a part of assignment 20 that I asked you to actually break down for me. It says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States." Okay. So what does it mean? Assignment 20 asks you to break some of these things down. For example, we, the people of the United States, do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States. A question here I would ask is, how do you and other Americans show that you consent to be governed under a Constitution? The word consent in this case means agree to, right? Agree to. Ways that we show, and if you were sitting in front of me, I would ask you this question, and hopefully some of you could think, how do we show how we agree to be governed under this document that we call the Constitution? Well, we follow the laws. I mean, that's number one. We agree to follow the laws. We agree to things like stopping at traffic lights. That's following the law. We also agree to things like paying taxes. We agree to an election process, right? And this is what an appropriate time to be talking about the Constitution in an election year. The states have the obligation to collect votes from their citizens, and however those citizens vote through the Electoral College process will determine a president of the United States. That's in the Constitution. So there are many ways and many things that we do. And simply one way that we consent to a Constitution is we follow the laws that are established. When a society doesn't follow the laws that are established and it goes into anarchy, then it's not following the Constitution, and that's any country. In order to form a more perfect union, think about this. Prior to the American Revolution, and even during the American Revolution for that matter, we were not always a perfect union of states. The states were very fragmented, and it really took a constitution, the American Constitution, to bring us together. The Articles of Confederation was not a unifying document, right? States were kind of doing whatever they wanted. And I ask you a question here: how does this phrase relate to the revolutionary call in that to join or die statement, right? Where we have the snake that's fragmented. Well, it's a call to unify. And, the nation is constantly challenged on this issue of unification. And we see it in politics a lot in the present. We see it in what we would call blue versus red states, right? We're having a lot of rhetoric or a lot of talk about how we're not really unified right now. We need something to reunify us. And it's a challenge that we've had throughout our history of states that have felt different from other states and how they believed either the Constitution should be interpreted or how their way of life should be interpreted. And of course, an interpretation of this led to an American Civil War in 1861, right? So, I mean, it's been a big problem throughout our history, and it even led to a civil war. Establish justice. One of the questions I have here is, why were the framers concerned about treating everyone equal based on past experiences? And when we say equal, remember, in the frame mind of a founder, 1787, it wasn't that all people are equal. It was that white men were equal. Women had a place in society, and everybody else below them had a place in society, right? So this idea of justice and equality really has to do with an original idea between the colonies and Great Britain or England, and how the states, hence the colonies, wanted to feel like they had some equality in this partnership or this union. And they wanted to have some justice, justice under the law, where people would be presumed innocent until proven guilty, where people had a right to property and they had the right to pursue happiness. Ensuring domestic tranquility, this idea that, that we would have peace, because really what is domestic and tranquility? It means to have peace at home. And there are many past events that made people afraid that violence could break out in this nation. And there's been acts of violence throughout our history, even if you go back into all the way from the 1700s to the present. There's been acts of violence where people didn't feel like they were being treated equally, or they weren't being heard. The American Civil Rights Movement is a good example of that, where there's marches that take place, some violent, many nonviolent, but still. Provide for the common defense, right? Who provides for the common defense? Did we have anybody providing for the common defense under the Articles of Confederation? No. That was one of the major weaknesses of it. We couldn't tax, we couldn't collect taxes, couldn't force states to pay. Therefore, we couldn't raise an army, and therefore things like Shays' Rebellion would develop. And we're going to find out that we would be challenged again. We're going to be challenged again under something called the Whiskey Rebellion, and we're going to talk about that later on, about how people start to get upset because they're being taxed again. But this time, the Constitution is in place, and it's able to respond to this, to provide for the common defense. And to promote the general welfare, right? What are examples of things that would constitute citizens' general welfare? Education, perhaps. To provide for, the needs of the needy when they need help, general welfare. There's many things that we could probably think of. If we think about it in the modern world in 2020, we might consider the general welfare of the people to have health care. We might consider that to be general welfare. Does everybody have the right to have health care? Some people may disagree with that. They might say, it's not my responsibility to pay for somebody else's health care. It's their responsibility to work and pay for that themselves. Others would argue it's the right of every citizen to have health care, and it's protected under the fundamental rights of the Constitution. And secure the blessings of liberty, right? Why were individual liberties so important for our founding fathers to include? Why was the Bill of Rights something that many anti-federalists would require be added? List of individual rights to be included in the Constitution, because they were afraid that they would be violated. So liberty, this idea of freedom, is something that early people recognized was something that was a privilege to have, and that they wanted to protect that. And the American Revolution, and winning it, was the fight to secure those liberties. So, of course, it seems logical that they would want to add this. Another show that or another tape that I would actually recommend that you watch is something that I also posted on this week's videos. I would recommend that you watch this classic scene from a really popular show that was on when I was much younger too, called The Andy Griffith Show. And Don Knotts here, this is Don Knotts, and this is Andy Griffith, the guy down here. Some of you may have seen this. Don Knotts plays Barney Fife, Deputy Barney Fife, and he's going to show Andy that he remembers the preamble from 8th grade. So watch this and see if, could you do this? Could you recite the preamble if you learned it like Barney says that he can? Check it out. It's pretty interesting. Pause right now and watch this. It's entertaining. It's kind of funny. There are some basic principles. There are some basic principles of the Constitution, and one of them that we've identified actually in assignment number 19 is something called popular sovereignty, right? And one of the foundations of this document states that citizens are the source of the government's power, that the government is the citizens. It is the citizens who create the government, but it's also the citizens who decide what the government can and cannot do. And this is a fundamental thing to Americans, that the republic that we live in, or our American democracy, is this idea that our voices count. Our voices collectively as a group have power. So popular sovereignty, means that the citizens are the source of the government's power. When we speak and the government responds to that, because the government is of the people and by the people and for the people. The idea of something called civic republicanism is also an important part of a principle of the Constitution. This idea that citizens choose their representatives in government. We choose members of the Senate and the House of Representatives. We choose through our vote a president, right? We choose these people because we want them to represent our needs. And also, as a part of this idea of civic republicanism, is that we have the responsibility to know what our government's doing, and we have a responsibility to voice our opinions when we think the government has failed to do its job. Being a part of the United States means you're actively staying informed. As a citizen, you have you're civically, that means like related to government, you're civically responsible to ensure that you stay informed of the issues, scratch my eye there, and that you react when the government fails to perform or do the job that the people have asked it to do. In some cases, it may be you replace those representatives who are not doing their job with somebody who you believe will. Because, again, we're not forcing people to represent us. They're volunteering to do it, and they're paid to do it in many cases, especially at the state and federal level. And they have an obligation to meet our needs. They have an obligation to do that. And if we don't like what they're doing, then we just don't reelect them. Another principle is the idea of individual rights, right? We have basic liberties and rights that are guaranteed and protected in the Constitution and all the amendments that have been created thereafter, right? The first 10 amendments or changes to the Bill of Rights, we collectively call them the Bill of Rights, the first 10. And they were added immediately at the ratification of the first document, the first Constitution. That was the condition that was agreed upon. And we're going to talk about what those 10 amendments are later on. So those outline for us what you and what I have that are protected. You might think of some of them as like the right to freedom of speech or the right to freedom of religion. But there are many, many more besides that we'll talk about. Another principle is this idea that each branch of government holds some control over the other branches. This is a principle that's called checks and balances. So it's kind of hard to see it down here. So let's pull it up a little bit. But it's this idea that no one branch of government that we'll talk about should have more power or less than the other. And in fact, one branch should be able to check on the other, like look over the other branch's shoulder to ensure that it's doing what it's supposed to do. And if it's not, should have a balance to that. So if you look at this illustration here, we just go from left to right. One of the branches, called the judicial branch, is supposed to uphold federal and state constitutions and laws. It can declare acts that the president or the executive branch performs as unconstitutional. But as a check to that branch, one of the powers that the executive branch has is that it nominates federal judges to court. So it can nominate a federal judge to court, but those judges in turn are supposed to check on the executive branch to ensure that they're not violating the law in any way. And it kind of goes, if you look at this illustration here, there's checks and balances on each one. So if you remember from assignment 19, one of the important powers of the judicial branch is that they interpret the Constitution, right? They interpret laws. They make sure that laws are not violating other laws. One of the powers of the executive branch is to enforce laws, to make sure that laws are followed. And probably the most important power of the legislative branch, which is Congress, right, is that they are the ones that make the laws. Now, they need a little bit of help from the president because the president has to sign those laws. But if the president doesn't sign those laws because they don't like them, they still have a way to override a president who doesn't want to sign and still create a law anyway. That's one of those checks and balances on that system. Okay, so there's lots of things that go into this check and balance system. Federalism, limited government, and the idea of separation of powers. Let's just kind of put these kind of under where they kind of fit here. Some other basic principles are the idea of limited government. When I asked some of you in assignment 19 to tell me what you thought was one of the most important powers that it's outlined sort of within the Constitution, many of you said limited government, which I thought was very interesting. What is limited government? The Constitution limits the actions of government by specifically listing powers that it has, but also powers that it doesn't have. Okay, so the beautiful thing about this document is it not only says what the government can do, but it infers what it can't do, what's maybe left for the states to do or individuals to do, which is really fascinating when we think of this as a living document. It's a living, alive document that changes. The idea of separation of powers, that each of the three branches of government has its own responsibilities and has its own kind of like job to do if you think about it. And I mentioned them in the last slide. Legislature passing laws, executive enforcing laws, the judiciary, the court system is interpreting those laws. And then the last one that we've talked a lot about in this class is the idea of federalism, where we divide power between a national government and state governments. One of the great exhibitions of federalism, one of the great ways that we sort of see this play out, is we see it play out in a national election where all the states, are in charge of collecting votes for their own state. And then through the electoral college process, we determine who a president's going to be, right? A federal government doesn't determine the president. States determine the president. The people in those states determine the president. And as you can see, I get really animated here and kind of passionate. It's because people forget sometimes, when they feel threatened by a statement by a leader that's in the federal government, they feel threatened by that. The power does not lie in one person to make decisions. It lies collectively in us, through the states, through our representatives, through Congress, right? So we can't get too excited. We have to believe and trust in federalism. We have to believe and trust in the separation of powers and that government is limited. Our three branches of government, right? The judicial, the executive, the legislative, make up what we call the national government. Sometimes I've referred to this as the federal government or the central government, but it's essentially the three branches that we have. And the articles of the Constitution break down for us the powers that each of these three parts has. Okay. And if you go back and you look at those pages that I mentioned when we first started this lecture, you can see how they're broken down. And I'm not going to have you break them all down and look at them all, and because a lot of it you probably won't remember anyway. But just know where they are and and what sort of how they are broken up. I have a question here for you. Maybe some of you recognize this building. It says, "What is this building and who works here?" Right? Is it A, the Capitol, known as the Supreme Court? Is it the White House, called Congress? Is it the Capitol, called Congress? Is it the Pentagon, or where the president is? This is actually, if you're looking at this and you're saying, "Mr. Klinger, that's way too easy." That's good if you're saying it's way too easy. This building should be very recognizable to you because it's C. It's the Capitol in Washington, D.C. It's what we call Congress, okay? And this is actually where when a president is sworn into office, it occurs at the steps. It occurs down here at the bottom of Congress. And this is very, very poetic in a way because it's happening in front of the building where the people's voice is heard. On the right-hand side of this building is where the House of Representatives is, where all 435 members of Congress meet to discuss issues that people care about. And on the other side is where all 100 senators meet. On this side, the left-hand side of this picture. So these two groups are meeting essentially, I guess you could say, under the same roof called Congress. And it's, of course, built on the classic Roman architecture. We get a lot of our influences from the Roman Republic, right? This is sort of our influence. It's sort of that Enlightenment beginning that we've talked about so much in this class. Let's talk a little bit about the powers of these three branches and what they can do. And how, maybe if you're interested in being a representative of the people, what could you do to be a part of this group? Let's start with Congress. Congress has two parts. I just said it earlier. One part is called the House of Representatives, and there are 435 members of the House, and that's determined by the population of each state. This goes back to the Virginia Plan, right? The Virginia Plan is what establishes this precedent. The other part is the Senate, and this is based upon the New Jersey Plan, right? The New Jersey Plan. Each state gets 2 representatives, which makes up 100 members of this body. How old do you have to be a member of Congress? Well, if you want to be a member of the House of Representatives, you got to be 25 years old. That's the minimum age requirement. You have to be a citizen of the United States for at least 7 years. So can you be a member of the House and be born outside of the United States, become a citizen, and then run? Yes, you can. You absolutely can. You serve a 2-year term at one time. So every 2 years, you have to be reelected by the people to serve in that House. For the Senate, you can see my birthday cake here, right? Some of us that are getting older wish we were 30 again. But you got to be at least 30 years old. You got to be a citizen to be a member of the Senate for at least 9 years. 9 years, that's 9. But you get to serve 3 times as long as a member of the House of Representatives. You get a 6-year term. One of the things that I might want you to think about, and I'm not going to tell you the answer because I want you to think about it, but why do you think we have different lengths or term limits? Why do you think one is longer than the other? Right? Why are they not both the same? Think about that. Think about why that might be important. So how many people are there in Congress today? Well, if you take 435, which is the actual number right now, and you add 100 to it, it'd be about 535 people total in Congress. What are some of the powers that Congress has, this legislative branch? Well, Probably the number one most important power, in my opinion, is that they have the power to make laws. They have the power to make laws. They also have the power to approve presidential appointments. They have the power to approve the printing of money. The printing of money. Yes, the printing of currency. They can determine how much money is printed and put into what we call circulation within the United States and the world. They have the power to declare war. The group of Congress, right? Declaring war is not made by one individual, it's made by the representatives of the people collectively. And then lastly, probably one of the other most important powers is they have the power to approve treaties. A treaty is an agreement between two nations, okay? Sometimes it can be a peace treaty. Sometimes it can be a trade treaty, an agreement with another nation for a trade negotiation or something like that. So these are sort of the fundamentals here, right? And if you're looking at your notes right here, they're kind of listed like down in kind of an order. What is the most important power of the legislative branch? I think I just said it. I think I just said it was making laws, because that's probably where they spend 99% of their time, or 90, I won't go 99, 95% of their time is probably spent on arguing about laws that are being proposed and then voting on them. Okay, very little time is spent on declaring war, to be honest, because we don't have that many wars very often, thank goodness. Approving treaties probably comes after making laws, and they don't actually have the power to declare laws unconstitutional. That's not even an option for them. That's actually a part of the judicial branch that we'll talk about. So if making laws is such an important function of Congress, how does that work? How does that work? If you look at assignment number 20, I have asked you to watch a video on how a bill becomes a law. Another great Schoolhouse Rocks video. But essentially, here's the steps. A bill is introduced. Generally, a bill is basically a proposed law. It's a document that describes what a law is, what it wants to be. It's generally started in the House of Representatives, even though if you look at this, it's kind of got the bill starting here at the Senate. It can really start, most of the time they start at the House of Representatives. They go through a whole series of committees or groups of people who argue whether they're worthy actually to be even discussed on the floor of Congress. If they are worthy of that, and members of Congress have had a lot of time to ask questions about the language of the bill, then it goes to the House floor and it's voted on. And if you get a majority of the members of the House of Representatives to say that they like the bill by voting yes on it, you need 218 out of 435 to get a majority. Then it goes before the Senate, and the whole process does the same thing, right? It goes in front of a Senate committee. They argue about it. They might make some changes to it, and then they'll send it to the Senate for a vote there. And again, it needs a majority to pass. If it passes, and I'm just going to tell you straight up, 98.9% probably of all bills that are even proposed in Congress don't even get to the floor to be discussed or argued about. It's a very small fraction that actually do pass this point. Then it goes before the president, who has two choices. They can sign it, and boom, it becomes a law, or they can veto it. They can just say, I'm not going to sign it, by not signing it, or they can wait. They can wait on it. And that's called a pocket veto, because there's a certain amount of time that a president has to sign a proposed bill from Congress. And if they wait beyond that time, that's called a pocket veto, and it's like they didn't sign it. Okay? What happens then? Well, in many cases, it may die there. It's called dying, D-I-E. It may die, and it may never return back to Congress to be argued again or changed, because the Congress may not think it's worthy of their time. But let's say it is worthy of their time. And let's say that they feel like the president is not in touch with the needs of the people. It can go before the House and Senate again, the same bill, and with a 2/3 majority vote in favor of the bill, they can override that veto by the president, and it can become a law still. Okay, this is one of those checks and balances that exist between the executive branch and the legislative branch. All new bills, no matter what happens, go through a process called judicial review. So here's where the judicial branch comes into this whole lawmaking part. They have the power to determine, does the law that's been signed, does it violate any other laws? And if it does, then it won't go into effect. So the judicial branch has to affirm that the law is good, essentially, and that it doesn't violate any other laws. Now, let's be honest about this. Most of the time, these bills that go before the House and the Senate and before they reach the president, they've had a lot of lawyers look at the language of the bill to make sure that it doesn't violate any other law because they don't want it to be rejected, right? And one of the roles of the federal court system, in the Supreme Court for that matter, is to listen to arguments where they believe laws, or where the people believe a law needs to be changed because it violates some individual right or the rights of the people. If it does, then it can be rewritten potentially and changed and then be reintroduced to the whole process. So check out the Schoolhouse Rocks video about how a bill becomes a law because it's really entertaining, and I think it does probably a much better job than I just did trying to explain this process to you. Which of the following does a bill have to pass through before it goes to the executive branch? Well, hopefully you said D, the House and the Senate, because that's the correct answer. What role does the Supreme Court play in the process of lawmaking, essentially? If you said D is in dog, declares laws unconstitutional, then you would be correct. All right, we're going to skip this slide. So ultimately, how does a bill become a law? Well, the bill must pass through both houses with a majority vote in Congress, and the president must sign the bill for it to become a law, or it can be overridden by Congress with a 2/3 majority. Okay. And here's the how a bill becomes a law, and I've added this link into assignment number 20. So you can take a look at that if you want to stop now, or maybe you've already watched it as a part of assignment 20.
The important thing is...
All right. This link is also embedded into assignment number 20. Or this is a different link, but the link that I give you basically is going to do the same thing. All right. Let's talk about the executive branch. All right. So maybe some of you recognize that tune. Maybe some of you didn't. And maybe some of you recognize the name that was on the screen. It's called Hail to the Chief. And I bet a lot of you didn't know this, but the president actually has their own tune. They have their own song called Hail to the Chief. And the story behind that goes basically that when President Washington was entering rooms when he was president, early on in his presidency, a lot of people didn't know he was in the room because he wasn't announced. And a lot of members of Congress and part of the president's cabinet felt like there should be a way to more formally recognize the president on official engagements, right, between other nations or in important events where the president could be recognized because out of respect for the office of the presidency. So that song was actually written with the intent to be used only for the president of the United States. It's called Hail to the Chief again. And it would be played on formal occasions where the president would essentially, the song would start and then people would recognize that the president was coming into the room. Now, this was kind of a dicey thing, right? Because we didn't want to have a song that was royal in its sense. Like, we didn't want, the president's not a king, but we felt like there had to be some kind of way for people to stop what they were doing and recognize that the leader of our country was coming into the room for like an introduction or a more formal occasion. And that's where the song really starts from. And it starts in Washington's sort of tenure in his administration. So since we're talking about Washington, and we know that Washington was the first president of the United States, obviously, I hope that we know that. The executive branch, which is another branch of our government, makes up basically the president, the vice president, and the members of what we call the president's cabinet. These are people who are, you could consider them to be like advisors or heads of different departments of our nation, okay? And all of them collectively together are known as the executive branch. The president serves a 4-year term with a maximum of 2 terms. So a president can serve up to 8 years. Yeah, 8, sorry. I don't know where my camera is. 8 years. And it wasn't always 8 years, actually. There actually were no term limits until after the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, and during essentially at the end of Truman's term, before President Eisenhower was elected, they decided, Congress, that there had to be term limits. And so they changed the Constitution to include that it would be a maximum of 2 terms. Can you serve them separately from each other? Yes, you can. In fact, that's come up in recent politics, right? Some people who are saying that, well, you know, if President Trump is going to leave office, he might leave for 4 years, and then people might try to reelect him again. Who knows? That's a long ways off in my mind, and probably yours too. Some qualification requirements. There are 3 actually for this. You have to be born in the United States to be president. Okay? You have to be born on American soil. You have to be 35 years old. That's the minimum age. And you have to have lived in the United States for 14 years, a resident of the United States. So in other words, you can be born in the US, be 35 years old, and have moved to Germany, right? Or Japan. Let's just throw those out there. And then all of a sudden you say, you know what, I want to be president. Well, you can't just come back at 35, having been gone for 30 plus years, and say, I want to be president, poof, put me on the ballot. No, you have to show that you've lived in the United States. So use your melon here a little bit and think about why that's so important. You know, you have to be somebody who's maybe not influenced by outside ideas, behaviors, be influenced in some way by a foreign nation, and show that you're actually living here, so that you understand the American people, and that you're not influenced by outside sources. I don't know how else to say that, but it's something to think about. There are 6 main powers of the presidency. Number 1 is their chief of state. What is chief of state? Well, they can propose new laws. They can propose new laws. So let me just back up here really quick and see what I did. All right. Let me just kind of go through these. Let's talk about their titles, I guess, first, since that's the way I have my slides organized here, if I can get this to work properly. We call them chief of state. They're also the legislative leader of our nation. We sometimes refer to them as the chief executive. They're also our chief diplomat. They're like the person who is like the face of America. Like when they go overseas and they deal with other nations, they're like the top negotiator if we're talking about making deals with someone. And they're also our commander in chief. They're responsible for responsible for all the armed forces, all the military in our country. They have a lot of power, actually. It's not ultimate power, but it's a lot of power. Okay, so here we go. They can propose new laws. In fact, many times a president will call members of Congress and say, "Hey, I want to get this done. What do you think? And can we write a bill that might try to accomplish this?" Probably the most famous recently that you've probably heard of is Obamacare, right? President Obama wanted to see healthcare be more available to Americans, so he called up members of Congress. They wrote this plan for a healthcare plan. It got a tag called Obamacare because it came from the White House and it was put into law. The president, and I know this is a little bit old, this doesn't have Trump, but the president has the power to what we call convene Congress in times of an emergency. So he can call Congress together and ask to meet to talk to them in the event of an emergency. He has the power to deliver what's called the State of the Union. And every year, generally around the beginning of the year, in January, I believe, the president will deliver a speech on the floor of the House of Representatives to all members of Congress, as well as the chief justices of the Supreme Court, his cabinet, and the heads of the military branches. And he basically tells the people, American people, here's what we've done this year, and here's where I want to see us go. It's called the State of the Union. It's televised. I highly recommend that you watch it every year. It's very, very informational. The president has the power to direct foreign policy. The president has the power to make treaties with foreign nations. Okay. The president, probably the most important job that they have is to enforce laws that are made by Congress. They have the power to appoint government officials, right? The power to appoint members of the federal court system. They also have a really unique power called the pardoning power, where they can essentially say to a person who's been convicted of a crime that you're free and that the punishment that you've been accused of is no longer valid. It's one of the unique powers of a president that they use generally at the end of their presidencies. By the way, governors have that same power. Governors have the pardon power within their states. Okay. The president also is supposed to be a representative of all Americans. It doesn't matter what political party they campaign for, but they're supposed to be a representative of all of us as our leader. They also give honors to U.S. citizens, like awards and medals. One of the things that a president can do that nobody else can is award the Medal of Honor, our highest military award. There's also another medal that only they can give out called the Medal of Freedom, which is the highest medal given to a non-military person or a civilian. And then they also receive foreign officials, foreign diplomats, leaders of other nations. They receive them, and they are our face, essentially, of America. They have the power to use the military to intervene in crises around the world. And they also have the power to enforce order in the United States. That being that they have the power to call in the military in the event of a natural disaster or of a crisis like some kind of rebellion. They have the power to call the military to enforce laws, basically, and that's what that power is meant for. Okay. The third branch is the judicial branch. And the judicial branch, or the Supreme Court in this case, and the federal court systems below it, consists, in this case, the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in our land, consists of 9 Supreme Court justices. One is called the Chief Justice, and then there's 8 associate justices. Okay, you could think of the Chief Justice as sort of being like the guy who is the leader of the group, though they all have equal say and equal opinions about arguments that are brought to them. It's not like the Chief Justice has more power over the other justices in the sense of making decisions. They're more of just like a face of a leader, and they decide, and sometimes they'll decide which cases are going to be heard by the members and which cases in the order that they're going to go in, and who's going to write the decisions of those cases when the court makes decisions. One of the unique things about a member of the Supreme Court, the highest court of this federal court system, is that they serve a term for life. And there's language in the Constitution that says it's a term for life based on good behavior. Okay, a very, very loose term, by the way, and very kind of vague. Like, what does that mean? Good behavior. Well, we don't really know because nobody has ever been removed from the Supreme Court for not having good behavior, which is kind of an interesting thing. But it provides an interesting part of government where you have these different levels of service, right? You got the House of Representative members who serve 2 years. You got members of the Senate who serve 6. You've got the president who can serve 4 and then be reelected for another term, which would be a total of 8. And then you got this group of 9 people who serve a lifetime. And they're the only ones that serve a lifetime. So once they're nominated by a president, that's one of the powers of the presidency, is to nominate someone to the Supreme Court. The Senate is the one that will confirm them. In other words, interview them and decide, are they worthy to sit on the highest court of this nation? Now, the interesting thing about this is, to be a member of the Supreme Court, there really are no qualifications required in writing. You don't even have to technically be a lawyer to sit on the Supreme Court. However, historically, we have always chosen people for the Supreme Court who have a record of being a judge prior to this in lower courts. And, being a lawyer kind of helps to be a judge. I mean, it's kind of like a pre-qualification in many cases. So it's an interesting thing to think about. But, with the appointment of Amy Barrett recently to fill out Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's absence from her death, it really created, as some of you saw in the media, a lot of media attention. Where they started to politicize these people and things like that, which is really unfortunate because members of the Supreme Court are supposed to be very neutral. They're supposed to interpret the Constitution on its value for what it is, but that's a whole nother discussion. Some of the things that the judicial branch does is it makes sure that all other laws are consistent with the Constitution. So when there's a law that's proposed and passed in a state or the federal government, one of the jobs of the Supreme Court in the judicial branch is to determine, is that law valid? Is it consistent? So, for example, is it legal to assist in someone's death if they give their consent, right? In some states, I'll tell you, it is. And in some states, many states, it's not. So if I said to you, and I know this is kind of a morbid discussion, but if I said, I'm really sick, I just don't want to live anymore, couldn't you help me in my life? If you help me in my life, it might be illegal in some states to do that, but in other states, it might be perfectly legal under a doctor's supervision and doctor being aware of what everything's going on. If you ever want to know more about this, I'll tell you a story about my mom. And we can talk about that, about how that played out in my family personally. The court decides what the Constitution says, essentially, what the language says and interprets that. But it also reviews lower court decisions. So all these different courts that exist below it in the framework of the federal justice system in the states, all these courts below it, where issues are brought initially, can work their way up to the top of the pyramid through what's called the appeals process. So let's say that I accuse you of something, you're found guilty of it, and you say, I don't think that that's fair. You can file under the law what's called an appeal, APPEAL. And that appeal, if the court believes that there's been some problem with the decision, whether it was a violation of your constitutional rights or there was a problem with the proceedings of the court, maybe something was not, something was wrong, then the court might say, we'll hear your appeal and we'll reconsider that. Or they might say, we want a lower court to hear that again and re-argue the case. And that's a way for you to essentially exercise your right under the Constitution to be protected by the law. So lower courts cannot make decisions about whether or not it is publicly constitutional to segregate schools, for example. I mean, the Supreme Court decided in Brown versus Board of Education that segregation was wrong. And that, by the way, didn't happen until the 1960s, which is kind of a long time. Okay. But there's all kinds of court cases that we can talk about. One important question that I ask you a lot about in this class, and I think I've asked you this in assignment number 19, and I think it's also in assignment number 20, is what judicial review is. The idea that the Supreme Court's power to examine the laws and actions of local, state, and national governments and cancel them if they violate the Constitution is called judicial review. And it begins with a court decision, a Supreme Court decision that you should have read about called Marbury versus Madison in 1803, right? Where Chief Justice at the time, Marshall, decided, like, look, it's the role of the court to determine what the law means. And it comes out in this court case. And it's very clear that the court's position will be to be the interpreter of law, essentially. Okay? So when you think about how does this apply to me, like, Mr. Klinger, this is all like hypothetical stuff. I think it's like all Washington, D.C. It's not where I live. Well, I want you to think about how these branches are all the way down to the local level. So what I've done here is I've kind of given you that and kind of show you here that these three branches of government can be thought of not only from a Washington, D.C. level, which is the national level, or the state level, right, where we have governors and we have what we call state assemblies in the Senate and the state Supreme Courts, but also at the local level. We have these three branches all the way down to the city of San Mateo. We have a mayor. That's kind of like our version of a president. We have a city council. That's sort of like our version of a legislative branch. And then we have circuit courts, which are sort of our versions of, it's not exactly like a Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court has actually power over all these, the state Supreme Courts and the circuit courts. But you kind of get the idea that there are positions within government that it's like a cake effect or a tiered effect. Okay. So just think about that and really stop this video and really look at this slide so that you can see how it's sort of broken down all the way down here to the grassroots, on the streets of San Mateo, for example. All right. This video has been very long. I know that. And hopefully you will break it up into parts, because that's the way it's intended to be delivered. I know that our attention span is not an hour long. But let's take a look and do a little quiz here. Actually, do I want to do a quiz? No. Let's not do a quiz. I'll do a quiz with you guys actually in class and ask you some questions related to this. I think I'm going to stop this video here. Again, remember that what you need to know is broken down here for you from these slides onto these Gold Sheet Forward notes filled in. Okay? So utilize these notes. It'll be very, very helpful for you when we come time to an exam for this unit, Gold Sheet 4. There's the 4, right? Remember, this is normally on gold paper. And then you can kind of see what's sort of important here. I would save this file, make sure that you refer to it, and we'll talk more about this because it's a good review tool for our test. Okay? I thank you all if you were able to stand with me here and hang through this whole thing. And let's see, yeah, just survive this lecture. I know it was long, but